The air at 5 in the morning, just outside McLean, Virginia, is thick with the scent of damp earth and river fog rolling off the Potomac. It carries a particular quiet, a pre-dawn stillness that feels ancient and undisturbed, as if the last 200 years of progress were merely a rumor. But then, through the dense stands of oak and tulip poplar, a different kind of presence asserts itself. Not a mountain, not a natural ridge, but a structure. A long, low arrangement of concrete and glass that seems to absorb the nascent light rather than reflect it. This is the George Bush Center for Intelligence, but everyone knows it by its simpler, more resonant name, Langley. From the perimeter fence, it almost resembles a mid-century university campus, a place of quiet contemplation and scholarly pursuit. The lawns are impeccably manicured. The roadways sweep in gentle, unobtrusive arcs. There is an order here, a deliberate and curated serenity that feels less like an office park and more like a sanctuary. But sanctuaries are built for worship or for refuge, and the God worshipped here is information, and the refuge it offers is from a world of perceived chaos. The building's facade is a lie, but it is a necessary and beautifully constructed one. It speaks of openness with its thousands of windows, of a certain corporate transparency, a place of business like any other. Yet it is perhaps the most opaque 750,000 square feet on the planet. Every window is a one-way mirror, every wall is a barrier, every corridor a controlled space. It was designed to be a container, a vessel for the nation's deepest secrets, but over time, it became something more. It became a secret in itself. The central paradox of Langley is not just that it hides things, but that its very existence is a contradiction in a society that claims to value transparency above all else. What does it mean for a democracy, a government of the people, by the people, to build a fortress of silence at its very heart? A place where accountability is an internal affair and the truth is segmented, classified, and held by a chosen few. The building does not offer answers. It is a monument to the question itself, a question that began to form in the nervous, feverish years after a world war, when a new kind of conflict began, a war fought not with armies on open fields, but with whispers in back alleys, with secrets bought and sold, with shadows and ghosts. And for a war of shadows, its architects decided America needed a temple, a place where the darkness could be collected, studied, and weaponized, all behind a placid, academic facade nestled in the quiet Virginia woods. The silence that surrounds the Langley campus is not an absence of sound. It is an engineered and enforced condition. It is the silence of a library, the silence of a tomb, the silence of a place where thoughts are considered more dangerous than actions. To stand at its edge is to feel the immense weight of what is not being said, the crushing gravity of contained knowledge. The trees of the original Langley estate were not just cleared for a foundation of concrete. They were cleared for a foundation of ideology. This ground was sanctified for a new American religion, one where the scriptures were classified cables and the high priests were analysts who rarely saw the sun. The building itself is a character in this story, a silent protagonist that has outlived its creators and their initial purpose. Its walls have absorbed the anxieties of a nation, from the existential dread of nuclear annihilation to the bewildering complexities of asymmetrical warfare. It remembers the scent of stale cigarette smoke and panic during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It remembers the hum of the first mainframe computers, colossal machines that tried to impose a binary order on a deeply analog world. It remembers the hushed, grim conversations after the Bay of Pigs, when the building's pristine new corridors were first stained with the bitterness of failure. This place was conceived as a brain, a central nervous system for a global empire, processing threats and directing responses with cool, detached logic. But brains can be fallible. They can be plagued by paranoia, by hubris, by the cancer of self-deception. The building, in its cold, modernist logic, was meant to be a machine for producing truth. But the raw material it was fed, human intelligence, was inherently messy, compromised, and often deliberately false. And so, the machine produced what it was fed: a distorted reflection of the world, a funhouse mirror of fears and ambitions. To understand this building is to understand the slow, almost imperceptible shift in the American soul during the latter half of the 20th century. It is the story of how a republic, born from a revolution against the secret power of a king, came to create the most sophisticated apparatus of secret power the world has ever known. It is a story of good intentions and catastrophic consequences, of patriotism and its dark shadow. The green lawn gives way to reinforced concrete. The gentle facade hides a labyrinth. And inside that labyrinth, the very definition of truth became a matter of national security, a commodity to be protected not just from the nation's enemies, but from its own people. To comprehend the concrete and steel of Langley, one must first map the psychological terrain of the late 1940s and early 1950s. The world had not found peace, but had merely traded one global conflict for another, a hot war for a cold one. The victory of 1945 had been intoxicating but brief, quickly soured by the realization that the enemy had not been vanquished, but had simply changed its face. The Soviet Union, once a grim ally of necessity, now loomed as an ideological and existential threat, a monolithic entity whose motives were inscrutable and whose reach seemed limitless. The language of the era was one of infection, of corrosion, of infiltration. Communism was not just an opposing political system. It was a disease, a contagion that could rot a society from within. This fear was not abstract. It was visceral. It was the face of Alger Hiss on the front page, the whispered rumors of sleeper agents in the State Department, the televised interrogations of the House Un-American Activities Committee. The air itself seemed thick with suspicion. Who could be trusted? Was your neighbor, your colleague, your friend who they appeared to be? This pervasive paranoia created the fertile ground in which the seeds of a new kind of institution could grow. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's swashbuckling wartime intelligence agency, had been hastily dismantled after VJ Day by a President Truman deeply suspicious of a peacetime American Gestapo. But its absence was felt almost immediately. The old methods of diplomacy and military intelligence seemed utterly inadequate for this new kind of twilight struggle. The enemy was not a uniformed army but a network of spies, propagandists, and saboteurs. To fight them, America needed its own network, its own spies, its own masters of the dark arts. The Central Intelligence Agency was born from this necessity in 1947, a fledgling organization housed in a scattered collection of drab, temporary buildings around Washington, D.C., a testament to its uncertain and contested beginnings. This physical disarray was a source of deep frustration for its proponents. How could America project strength and permanence in this new global game when its nerve center was a collection of leaky, repurposed barracks? It was a sign of amateurism, of a nation not yet serious about the unending war it found itself in. The demand was not just for more office space. It was for a symbol, a fortress, a monastery, a place that would declare to the world, and more importantly to itself, that this new mission was not temporary. It was forever. At the center of this vision was a man who embodied the very ethos of the burgeoning intelligence community, Alan Welsh Dulles. He was not a bureaucrat, he was a true believer. A Princeton-educated lawyer from a family of diplomats and secretaries of state, Dulles saw the world as a great chessboard, a great game where nations were pieces and history was written by a small cadre of enlightened, discreet gentlemen operating behind the scenes. His experience in the OSS during World War II had confirmed his belief that history was not made by armies, but by information acquired, manipulated, and weaponized. For Dulles, intelligence was not a passive activity of collection and analysis. It was an active, aggressive pursuit. It was about shaping events, not merely observing them. When he became Director of Central Intelligence in 1953, he brought with him an almost messianic zeal. He saw the CIA not just as a government agency, but as the vanguard of Western civilization, the righteous blade in the fight against godless communism. And such an order of knights needed a proper castle. His frustration with the agency's scattered, anonymous buildings in Washington was palpable. It was a physical manifestation of the disrespect and misunderstanding he felt the agency endured. He envisioned a single, secure, and monumental headquarters that would serve both practical and psychological purposes. Practically, it would centralize operations, enhance security, and provide the space for the massive expansion he planned. Psychologically, it would be a statement. It would confer legitimacy. It would create a tangible heart for an otherwise invisible organization. A building, he understood, gives an idea permanence. It takes an abstract concept like central intelligence and gives it an address, a physical weight, a place on the map. He wanted a place that would inspire a sense of awe and mission in his recruits, a place that felt like the center of the world because, in his view, this was not about ego, or at least not solely about ego. It was about creating a culture. He wanted a sanctuary, isolated from the political squabbles and journalistic scrutiny of downtown Washington, where his people could work with a singular focus, buffered from the messy compromises of democratic life. The chosen location in the woods of Langley, Virginia, was perfect. It was close enough to the seat of power for influence, but far enough away for independence. It was a place apart, a world unto itself. He wasn't just building an office building. He was building a brain trust, a priesthood, and a fortress all in one. He was casting his own worldview in concrete. The choice of architect for such a project was a delicate and revealing one. To build a monument to secrecy, one might expect a designer known for imposing brutalist fortresses, someone who worked in the language of power and intimidation. But Allen Dulles and the Eisenhower administration chose the New York firm of Harrison and Abramovitz. On the surface, it was a logical choice. Wallace Harrison was a preeminent figure in American modernism, a Rockefeller favorite, and the lead architect for the United Nations headquarters. The UN building was the ultimate symbol of global openness, a glass palace dedicated to transparency and international dialogue. The irony, then, was profound and likely deliberate. To design their temple of secrets, they chose the very architects who had just completed the world's greatest monument to public diplomacy. This was a masterstroke of public relations, a way of cloaking the building's true purpose in the respectable, forward-looking aesthetic of corporate modernism. Langley would not look like the Lubyanka. It would not be a stone-faced monolith screaming of authoritarian power. Instead, it would adopt the visual language of a progressive American institution, a university science park, a pharmaceutical research headquarters, the home of a forward-thinking company like IBM. The design was a carefully calibrated exercise in deception. The long, horizontal lines, the repeating grid of windows, the campus-like layout, it all spoke of rationality, efficiency, and a certain benign bureaucracy. It was designed to be unimposing, to blend into the landscape, to be, in a word, forgettable. This was its genius. A building that screams, fortress invites challenge. A building that whispers, corporate office deflects it. Inside, however, the design brief was entirely different. The core of the original headquarters building was a puzzle box of security. The layout was a maze of controlled access points. The inner offices, particularly those for analysis and cryptography, were designed as secure cocoons, many without windows, shielded from electronic eavesdropping. The building was designed with a clear hierarchy in mind. The outer layers, with their views of the Virginia woods, were for the administrative and executive functions, the face the agency showed to itself. The deeper you moved into the building's core, the more secret the work became, the more restricted the access, and the more the architecture became about pure, unadorned function. It was a physical manifestation of the need-to-know principle. The very structure of the building enforced the compartmentalization of information. An analyst working on Soviet missile capabilities would never cross paths with an agent running operations in Latin America. The hallways and corridors were arteries designed to keep the bloodstreams of information separate. It was a factory for secrets, and the architecture was the assembly line. Before the first concrete could be poured, the land itself had to be acquired, an act that was itself a quiet exercise in the agency's burgeoning power. The site was a 240-acre tract of woodland and farmland known as the Langley Estate, owned by the well-regarded Gunnell family. For generations, it had been a piece of bucolic Virginia countryside, a world away from the machinations of the capital just across the river. The narrative presented to the public was one of simple government expansion, a necessary acquisition of land for an unnamed federal agency needing to consolidate its offices. But behind the scenes, the process was a demonstration of the power of eminent domain when wielded by the invisible hand of national security. The choice of this specific land was no accident. It was strategically perfect. It was buffered by the George Washington Memorial Parkway on one side and the Potomac River on another, creating natural barriers. It was secluded, surrounded by dense forest that would act as a visual and acoustic screen, shielding the future facility from prying eyes and ears. The symbolism of the transformation was stark. A piece of pastoral America, a landscape of Jeffersonian agrarian ideals, was to be scraped clean and replaced with a concrete nerve center for a new, more muscular, and more secretive form of American power. The act of clearing the land was a metaphor for the larger project. Old-growth forest, with its complex, chaotic ecosystem, was bulldozed to make way for a man-made structure of rigid geometric order. The natural was being replaced by the artificial. The organic was giving way to the mechanical. This was the Cold War ethos in microcosm. A belief that the messy, unpredictable nature of the world could be controlled, managed, and ultimately dominated through superior information and centralized planning. The very ground was being remade in the image of the agency's mission. The funding for the project was another masterclass in obfuscation. The estimated $46 million cost was a staggering sum in the mid-1950s, and channeling it through a public congressional vote would have invited uncomfortable questions about the size and scope of this unnamed agency. Instead, the funds were hidden, tucked away in the appendices of other departmental budgets, moved through classified accounts, a river of dark money flowing towards the quiet woods of Virginia. This financial secrecy was the blueprint for thousands of future operations. Before the building even had a foundation, it was establishing the protocols of its existence. Operate in the shadows, avoid public scrutiny, and present a benign facade to the world while pursuing a hidden agenda. The acquisition and preparation of the Langley site was the agency's first successful domestic covert operation. The groundbreaking ceremony on November 3, 1955, was a carefully staged piece of political theater. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the old general who had overseen the Allied victory in Europe, plunged a ceremonial silver spade into the Virginia soil. Standing beside him was Allen Dulles, his expression a mixture of quiet triumph and solemn purpose. The speeches given that day were filled with the soaring rhetoric of the era, invoking the defense of freedom, the protection of the free world, and the righteous struggle against tyranny. The building was framed not as a headquarters for spies, but as a center for intelligence, a scholarly, almost academic institution dedicated to the dispassionate pursuit of truth. It was to be a vital organ for the nation's defense, a place where dedicated public servants would work tirelessly to prevent another Pearl Harbor. This was the public narrative, the story told to the American people and to the world. It was a narrative of defense, of reaction, of a nation reluctantly taking up the burden of global leadership in a dangerous time. But the private mission, the one understood by Dulles and the men around him, was far more ambitious and far more aggressive. The building wasn't just for defense. It was for offense. It was to be the command center for a global, undeclared war. From its secure rooms would flow the plans to topple governments, to manipulate elections, to fund foreign political parties, to spread propaganda, to arm insurgents. It was to be the brain of an invisible empire, an empire that operated on a set of rules entirely different from those that governed the republic it ostensibly served. The first shovelfuls of earth turned over that day were not just for a building's foundation. They were for the grave of an older, more innocent conception of America's role in the world. The isolationism of the pre-war years was being decisively buried, and in its place was rising a new doctrine of permanent global intervention. The building was the physical embodiment of this new reality. Its sheer size and projected cost were a declaration that this Cold War was not a temporary crisis. It was the new normal. The United States was committing itself, in concrete and steel, to a perpetual state of vigilance, a perpetual state of conflict. The structure rising from the Virginia clay would be a permanent fixture, not just of the landscape, but of American government. The trap was being built, a beautiful, efficient, and logical trap. It was a trap for the nation's enemies, certainly. But it was also a trap for the nation itself, a commitment to a path of secrecy and power from which it would become increasingly difficult to turn back. The construction of the original headquarters building was a project executed under a veil of secrecy that was unprecedented for a public works project in the United States. It was more akin to the building of a nuclear facility than an office building. Every worker on the site, from the architects and engineers down to the laborers pouring concrete and welding steel, had to undergo a rigorous background check. They were vetted, interviewed, and monitored. The implicit threat of being denied clearance was a powerful tool for ensuring compliance and silence. This was not a normal construction site where workers could speak freely about their daily tasks. An atmosphere of watchful quiet was deliberately cultivated. The materials themselves were subject to intense scrutiny. Specialized concrete mixes were used for the secure inner vaults. Miles of copper shielding were woven into the walls of sensitive areas to create what would later be known as sifts, preventing any electronic emanations from escaping and any external signals from penetrating. The building was being constructed as a Faraday cage, a sealed container for the nation's most volatile secrets. The project was a logistical behemoth, and its true cost, like an iceberg, was mostly hidden from public view. The official $46 million price tag was only the beginning. The real expenses were buried in classified budgets, masked as research and development costs, or funneled through the Department of Defense. This financial sleight of hand was essential. It allowed the agency to build its palace without having to justify its scale or its specialized features to a public that was already wary of unchecked government power. The building was, in essence, being built with black money, setting a precedent for the off-the-books financing that would define its most controversial operations for decades to come. There was a profound symbolism in this. A building dedicated to uncovering the secret finances of foreign governments was itself financed by secrecy. It was a structure born of the very methods it was designed to employ against others. The architects and builders were not just creating a physical space. They were beta testing the operational security protocols that would become the agency's hallmark. The construction site itself was a laboratory for the practice of secrecy, a place where the rules of the outside world were suspended. The building was learning to keep secrets even as it was being born. The internal geography of the new headquarters was a stark architectural expression of the class system inherent in the world of intelligence. The design was a deliberate creation of an upstairs and a downstairs, a visible world of power and a hidden world of labor. Upstairs, on the building's upper floors and along its periphery, were the executive suites. The director's office, on the 7th floor, was a cavern of mahogany, leather, and quiet authority, with a commanding panoramic view of the wooded campus and, in the distance, the Potomac. This was where the big picture was contemplated, where ambassadors were discreetly met, where decisions that would alter the fate of nations were made over coffee. These were the spaces of the visionaries, the gentlemen spies of Dulles' imagination. The architecture here was designed to project confidence, stability, and a timeless sense of establishment power. The wide corridors, the plush carpeting that muffled every footstep, the heavy wooden doors. It all contributed to an atmosphere of a private club or a university senior common room. This was the world of the case officers, the station chiefs, the Ivy League-educated elite who saw themselves as the rightful custodians of American foreign policy. But downstairs, or more accurately, deep within the building's core, was the machine room. Here, in vast, windowless chambers, buzzed the true engine of the agency. This was the world of the analysts, the cryptographers, the translators, the clerks, the secretaries, the invisible army. Under the relentless, shadowless glare of fluorescent lights, thousands of people sifted through the raw material of intelligence. They sat in endless rows of gray metal desks, translating intercepted cables, poring over grainy surveillance photos, plotting data points on maps, and typing up reports on clattering typewriters. The air was thick with the smell of paper, ink, and ozone from the massive, primitive computers that filled entire rooms. This was the downstairs world, a place of relentless, anonymous toil. The architecture here was stripped of all pretense. It was pure function. Concrete floors, acoustic tile ceilings, and a labyrinth of identical hallways designed for efficiency, not comfort. The lack of windows was a security feature, but it also served a psychological purpose. It divorced the workers from the outside world, from the rhythms of day and night, immersing them completely in the flow of information. Their reality was the teletype printout, the photograph, the coded message. They were the cogs in the great machine, and the building was designed to remind them of their place. The contrast was absolute. Upstairs, men with names made decisions based on curated summaries. Downstairs, anonymous men and women assembled those summaries from a chaotic torrent of raw data. The building's very layout enforced this separation, a concrete manifestation of the deep, often unacknowledged, divide between the glamorous, romanticized world of espionage and the grueling, bureaucratic reality of intelligence work. In the late summer of 1961, the building began to breathe. The last of the construction crews departed, and the first waves of employees began the great migration from their scattered, temporary offices in Washington to the new Virginia campus. For many, it was a moment of profound significance. After years of operating from the margins, from anonymous buildings and repurposed barracks, they finally had a home. A real home. The move to Langley was more than a change of address. It was a psychological consolidation. It fostered an immediate and powerful sense of shared identity and purpose. The campus-like setting, with its cafeterias, its credit union, its medical facilities, was deliberately designed to create an insular, all-encompassing world. An employee could, in theory, spend their entire day, from breakfast to after-work socializing, without ever needing to leave the secure perimeter. This was not an accident. Alan Dulles and the agency's leadership understood that to build the kind of dedicated, secretive workforce they needed, they had to cultivate a distinct culture, a tribe. Langley was to be the tribal ground. It was a sanctuary from a suspicious and often hostile outside world. Inside the fence, you didn't have to lie or obfuscate about where you worked. You were among your own kind. You could speak a common language of acronyms and code words. This shared reality forged powerful bonds, but it also created a dangerous echo chamber. The physical isolation of the campus mirrored a growing intellectual isolation. Surrounded only by like-minded colleagues, all steeped in the same Cold War dogma, it became increasingly easy to believe in the absolute righteousness of the mission and to dismiss outside criticism as naive or, worse, subversive. The building itself became a psychological tool for reinforcing this worldview. Its clean, rational, modernist lines suggested a world of order and logic, a stark contrast to the messy, irrational world they were trying to control. Working within its walls felt like being on the inside of history, at the very center of the global struggle. This sense of elite purpose was intoxicating, particularly for the young, brilliant minds recruited from the nation's top universities. They were told they were the best and the brightest, the silent guardians of the Republic, and their new headquarters was a physical testament to their importance. The building became a cage, but it was a gilded and very seductive one. It offered a sense of belonging and a powerful hit of meaning in a world that seemed to be losing its moral compass. The price of admission was simply a piece of your soul, a willingness to suspend the normal rules of ethics and accountability that governed the world outside the fence. The new headquarters was not merely a container for people. It was an active participant in the work itself. It was conceived and built as a vast information processing machine, a nervous system for a global network of sensors. Every aspect of its infrastructure was designed to move secrets securely and efficiently. At the heart of this system in the early days was a complex web of pneumatic tubes, a relic of the 19th century repurposed for the atomic age. Canisters containing classified documents would hiss through the walls, shooting from one secure vault to another, a physical manifestation of the flow of information. This was the building's circulatory system, pumping the lifeblood of intelligence through its concrete arteries. Deeper still were the communication rooms, the direct link to the outside world. Here, teletype machines chattered relentlessly, printing out endless streams of coded messages from CIA stations in Berlin, Tokyo, Saigon, and 100 other locations. These rooms were the nerve endings, the point where raw sensation from the global periphery entered the central brain. The noise was constant, a mechanical symphony of the Cold War. Translators and cryptographers worked in shifts around the clock, turning the chaotic noise of the world into understandable signals. Once decrypted and translated, a piece of intelligence would begin its journey upward through the building's hierarchy. It would be analyzed, cross-referenced, and incorporated into reports within the windowless vaults of the Analysis Directorate. The building's design facilitated this assembly line. An analyst working on Soviet economic data was physically and procedurally separated from one working on Cuban exile movements. This compartmentalization was a security protocol, meant to ensure that a single compromise couldn't jeopardize the entire system. But it also had a profound and often detrimental effect on the quality of the intelligence itself. It prevented the cross-pollination of ideas, created blind spots. The building's architecture, in its obsession with security, often prevented the left hand of the agency from knowing what the right hand was doing. The final product of this machine was the Presidential Daily Brief, the distilled essence of the world's secrets, delivered each morning to the White House. This was the ultimate purpose of the entire structure, the end point of the vast global network. The building was a funnel designed to take the infinite complexity of the world and reduce it to a few pages of clear, actionable intelligence for one man to read. It was a monument to the belief in a top-down, rational control of history, a belief that would soon be shattered by the messy realities of the very world it sought to dominate. The human cost of working within this machine was immense, a slow corrosion of the soul that the building's serene exterior completely concealed. The very architecture of secrecy began to seep into the psychology of its inhabitants. The first and most obvious cost was the burden of the secret itself. Employees were forbidden from discussing their work with anyone, including their spouses. This created a profound sense of isolation, a split in their identity. They would leave the all-encompassing reality of the campus each evening and enter a suburban world where they had to live a cover story. The simple question, "How was your day, dear?" became a minefield of evasion and half-truths. This constant need for deception, even with loved ones, was a heavy psychological weight. It bred a sense of detachment, of living life behind a mask. Over time, it could warp one's sense of self and reality. Paranoia, the occupational hazard of the spy, was not just directed at foreign adversaries. It became an internal condition. The building's culture of compartmentalization and need to know fostered a deep-seated suspicion among colleagues. Every office could be bugged, every phone could be tapped. The security measures designed to keep enemies out could easily be turned inward. Trust was a rare and dangerous commodity. The pressure to conform was intense. The agency recruited brilliant, independent thinkers, but the building and the bureaucracy it housed demanded uniformity. Dissent was often interpreted as a lack of loyalty, a potential security risk. The open, freewheeling debate of a university seminar was replaced by a rigid, hierarchical system where information flowed up and orders flowed down. To question the consensus was to risk your career. This was particularly true for the analysts in the windowless rooms. Their entire perception of the world was mediated through the classified information that flowed across their desks. They had no access to the open press, no way to gauge the reality of a situation outside the closed loop of the intelligence community. They were living in a manufactured reality, a world constructed entirely from secrets. The building was a sensory deprivation tank, designed to focus the mind, but also capable of distorting it. The tragic irony was that the fortress built to protect its inhabitants from the dangers of the outside world often created a more insidious danger within. It was a place that could slowly strip away one's individuality, one's critical judgment, and one's connection to the common human experience, all in the name of national security. The concrete was barely cured, the paint was still fresh on the walls, and the building had not yet settled into its foundations when it presided over its first, and perhaps most defining, catastrophe. In April of 1961, the pristine, logical, and hyper-controlled environment of Langley became the command center for one of the most ill-conceived and incompetently executed operations in American history, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The plan, born in the final years of the Eisenhower administration and enthusiastically championed by Allen Dulles and his deputy, Richard Bissell, was a perfect product of the agency's insular culture. It was elegant on paper. It was logical. It assumed a level of control over events that was pure fantasy. From the secure rooms of the new headquarters, the invasion of Cuba looked like a clean, surgical operation. The analysts, fed a steady diet of optimistic reports from Cuban exiles, predicted a popular uprising against Castro. The operators, confident in their ability to manage proxy forces, believed a small brigade of exiles could spark a revolution. The building itself, with its aura of technological and intellectual superiority, seemed to guarantee success. It was a place from which failure was simply unimaginable. But the real world, the messy, unpredictable world of Cuban politics and mangrove swamps, refused to conform to the tidy plans laid out in Virginia. The popular uprising never materialized. The element of surprise was lost. The invading brigade was quickly pinned down, overwhelmed, and defeated. In the frantic, desperate hours of the invasion, the Langley headquarters transformed from a center of cool, confident command into a tomb of dawning horror. The teletype machines chattered out messages of disaster. The men in the 7th floor offices, who had seen the world as their chessboard, could only watch in impotent fury as their pieces were swept from the board. The failure was total, absolute, and humiliatingly public. The brand new building, intended as a monument to American competence and power, was instantly consecrated with the stain of a colossal blunder. It was a brutal lesson in the limits of secret power. Hubris, nurtured in the sterile, isolated environment of the new campus, had crashed headlong into reality. The building could provide security, it could process information, it could facilitate communication, but it could not repeal the laws of human nature or the complexities of history. The Bay of Pigs was more than a failed operation. It was the moment the dream of Langley died. The dream of a clean, rational, and controllable world, managed by a small elite, was exposed as a dangerous illusion. The Fortress of Silence had produced a very loud and very public failure. The aftermath of the Bay of Pigs cast a long, dark shadow over the new headquarters. The building, which was supposed to be a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a bunker under siege. The primary threat was no longer a shadowy operative from the Kremlin, but the President of the United States. John F. Kennedy, who felt betrayed and misled by the agency, was famously quoted as wanting to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. While he never acted on that threat, the relationship between the White House and Langley was irrevocably damaged. A Cold War began within the Cold War, a silent, bitter struggle between the executive branch and its own intelligence service. Allen Dulles, the building's visionary and patriarch, was forced into retirement. His departure marked the end of an era, the end of the gentleman's spies, and the beginning of a more bureaucratic, more scrutinized, and more cynical age for the agency. The building that was his monument became his tombstone. The psychological impact on the agency's workforce was devastating. The initial sense of elite purpose and righteous mission was replaced by a defensive crouch. They had been hung out to dry, made the scapegoats for a failure that had been approved at the highest levels of government. A siege mentality took hold. The outside world was no longer just a place of threats to be monitored, but a source of hostile scrutiny to be deflected. The building's physical isolation began to deepen. The walls, both literal and metaphorical, grew higher. The sense of being a special tribe, a people apart, intensified, but now it was tinged with resentment and bitterness. The architecture, once a symbol of confident, forward-looking modernism, now seemed to take on a more defensive, brooding quality. The long, low profile felt less like a campus and more like a fortified position. The one-way mirrors on the windows seemed to reflect a new reality. The agency was now watching its own government with as much suspicion as it watched its foreign adversaries. The Bay of Pigs disaster fundamentally altered the building's role. It was no longer just a brain for processing information about the enemy. It became a fortress for protecting the agency from its own ostensible masters. It became a repository of institutional secrets, not just about foreign threats, but about its own actions, its own failures, and its own conflicts with the elected government it was supposed to serve. The seeds of the deep state narrative, of an unaccountable intelligence apparatus operating by its own rules, were sown in the fertile ground of this mutual distrust. The building became a cage in a new way, trapping the agency in a cycle of secrecy and defensiveness that would ultimately lead to its greatest crisis of legitimacy. If the 1960s cracked the foundation of Langley's authority, the 1970s brought the bulldozers. The accumulated sins of the agency's first quarter-century, conceived and directed from within the Virginia headquarters, came spilling out into the public domain in a torrent of shocking revelations. The catalyst was the Watergate scandal, which, while not a CIA operation, shattered the nation's faith in its government and created an unprecedented appetite for investigating the secret corners of the state. Journalists and congressional investigators began pulling at the threads of rumor and whispers that had surrounded the agency for years, and the entire tapestry of covert action began to unravel. The building, the ultimate symbol of impenetrability, was breached, not by spies, but by subpoenas. The fortress of silence was forced to speak. The Church Committee in the Senate, led by Senator Frank Church, launched a full-scale investigation into the intelligence community. For the first time, the American public was given a look inside the machine, and what they saw horrified them. The hearings revealed a history of shocking abuses of power, all planned and managed from the clean, corporate offices of Langley. There was MKUltra, the mind control program that involved secretly dosing unwitting American citizens with LSD. There was Operation Mockingbird, the program to secretly use journalists and media outlets for propaganda purposes. There was COINTELPRO, a vast domestic spying operation against anti-war protesters, civil rights leaders, and anyone deemed subversive. And most explosively, there were the family jewels, a collection of the agency's most closely guarded secrets, which included detailed plans to assassinate foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba, and Rafael Trujillo. The sterile hallways of Langley were suddenly recast in the public imagination. They were no longer the corridors of power where patriots defended the free world. They were the crime scenes where the Constitution had been systematically violated. The building itself became a symbol of a government run amok, a rogue element within the Republic. The revelations had a catastrophic effect on morale inside the agency. The workforce, which had always seen itself as the silent, unthanked guardian of the nation, was now publicly branded as a gang of criminals. The siege mentality that began after the Bay of Pigs hardened into a permanent state of embittered isolation. The building became a true bunker, a place to hide from the scorn of the American people. The trust between the agency and the public, a trust that Allen Dulles had tried to cultivate with the building's benign, academic facade, was completely shattered. The facade had been ripped away, and what lay beneath was ugly, illegal, and profoundly un-American. The building stood, but its moral authority had collapsed into ruin. Following the public excoriation of the Church Committee hearings, the agency and its Langley headquarters entered a period of retrenchment and decline. The 1970s, under the Carter administration, brought a wave of budget cuts and personnel reductions. The director, Stansfield Turner, a Navy admiral with a mandate to clean house, purged hundreds of covert operators in what became known as the Halloween Massacre. The building, which had been built for relentless expansion, suddenly felt hollowed out, oversized, and haunted. Its long corridors echoed with a new kind of silence, not the silence of focused work, but the silence of demoralization and uncertainty. The building became a burden, a physical reminder of a discredited past. Its very existence seemed to mock the new, more modest and legally constrained role the agency was being forced to adopt. The campus, once buzzing with the self-important energy of a secret global mission, now felt like a ghost town. The mission itself had become confused. The great ideological clarity of the Cold War had dissolved into the murky ambiguities of détente and a post-Vietnam national malaise. Who was the enemy? What was the purpose? The building offered no answers. It stood as a monument to a form of power that was now seen as illegitimate, a relic of an age of hubris. The physical structure itself began to show its age. The modernist aesthetic, once the cutting edge, now looked dated. The technology within its walls, once state-of-the-art, was becoming obsolete. The building, like the agency it housed, was at risk of becoming irrelevant. For the employees who remained, the work continued, but the swagger was gone. They were no longer the knights of the free world. They were chastened bureaucrats, their every move scrutinized by congressional oversight committees. The fortress had been breached not by foreign agents, but by domestic laws. The invisible government was now painfully visible, its actions constrained by legal frameworks and public opinion. Langley became less a command center and more a symbol of a deep American paradox. The nation still needed intelligence. It still faced threats, but it was no longer willing to grant its spies the unchecked power they had once enjoyed. The building became a cage for the agency itself, a constant, physical reminder of its past sins and its current limitations. It was a place built for kings now forced to serve committees. The grand vision of Allen Dulles, of a protected priesthood shaping world events from a secluded sanctuary, had died. What was left was a sprawling office complex filled with people trying to do a difficult job under a cloud of permanent suspicion, trapped within the concrete shell of a fallen empire. For a brief moment at the end of the Cold War, it seemed as though the building might finally become a true relic. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the great adversary that had justified Langley's existence for 4 decades was gone. The agency's primary reason for being had vanished. Pundits and politicians openly debated the need for a central intelligence agency in a unipolar world. The peace dividend was the talk of Washington, and many saw the sprawling Langley campus as a prime candidate for downsizing, a costly dinosaur from a bygone era. The building seemed destined to become a museum piece, a monument to a war that had been won. But history had other plans. The relative quiet of the 1990s was deceptive. New threats, more amorphous and decentralized than the Soviet monolith, began to emerge. Terrorism, cyber warfare, and failed states presented a different kind of challenge, one that the agency struggled to adapt to. The building, designed to fight a single massive enemy, had to retool itself to track 1,000 scattered ones. And then came the morning of September 11, 2001. In an instant, everything changed. The debate over the agency's relevance was silenced by the smoke rising from New York and the Pentagon. The failure to connect the dots and prevent the attacks was seen not as a reason to dismantle the agency, but as a mandate to make it infinitely larger, more powerful, and more technologically advanced than ever before. Langley, the aging fortress that had seemed on the verge of obsolescence, was instantly reborn. It became the white-hot epicenter of a new global war, the War on Terror. The national trauma of 9/11 swept away the last vestiges of the post-Vietnam skepticism. The public, gripped by fear, demanded security at any cost. The legal constraints imposed by the Church Committee were brushed aside by new laws like the Patriot Act. The agency was unleashed, its budget exploded, its powers expanded beyond anything Allen Dulles could have imagined. The building was no longer a chastened bureaucracy. It was once again the command center for a worldwide shadow war. Black sites, extraordinary renditions, drone strikes. A new, darker chapter in the agency's history was being written, and it was all being directed from the quiet campus in the Virginia woods. The building was revived, its purpose renewed with a terrifying clarity. It was no longer a relic of the past, but the frighteningly relevant heart of the 21st century security state. The old ghosts of MKUltra and COINTELPRO were forgotten, replaced by a new sense of urgent, existential mission. The machine had been restarted, and it was bigger and more powerful than ever. The physical manifestation of this rebirth was the construction of the new headquarters building. If the original headquarters building was a statement of Cold War permanence, the new addition was a declaration of 21st century dominance. Connected to the original by a tunnel, the new structure dwarfed its predecessor. It was a shimmering edifice of glass and steel, a projection of modern, technological power. The architectural language had shifted from the careful, almost benign modernism of the 1950s to the assertive corporate fortress aesthetic of the new millennium. More glass, yet less transparency. More space, yet more security. The expansion was a concrete and steel representation of the astronomical growth of the intelligence budget and the security state after September 11th. The campus, which had once been designed to blend into the woods, now asserted its presence with an unmistakable authority. The machine was growing, its appetite for data and personnel seemingly limitless. Inside the new building, the agency's technological capabilities were light years beyond the pneumatic tubes and primitive mainframes of the original. Now the core of the building was a vast server farm, the digital brain ingesting a planetary-scale torrent of information every second. Satellite imagery, electronic intercepts, financial data, internet traffic, the entire digital exhaust of humanity was being funneled into the servers humming deep within the Virginia campus. The analyst of the 1960s, poring over a single teletype message, was replaced by the analyst of the 2000s, staring at a bank of screens displaying data visualizations of incomprehensible complexity. The very nature of intelligence work was transformed. It was less about human sources and more about algorithms, less about whispered conversations in foreign capitals and more about finding patterns in the global data stream. The building became a mirror of a nation's renewed and expanded fears. The original structure was a fortress against a single, identifiable enemy. The expanded campus was a fortress against a world of amorphous, ever-present, and unpredictable threats. It reflected a new national psychology, one that saw danger everywhere and believed that the only path to safety was through total information awareness. The quiet campus in the woods had become the physical anchor of a global surveillance network of unimaginable scale and scope. The expansion was the final, definitive answer to the question of the agency's permanence. It was here to stay, larger and more powerful than ever, its foundations now sunk deep into the bedrock of the digital age. The building has now stood for over 60 years. It has outlived its creator, Alan Dulles. It has outlived its original adversary, the Soviet Union. It has outlived the very technological and political world it was built to dominate. Yet it remains. It has adapted, it has grown, it has become a permanent feature not just of the Virginia landscape, but of the American psyche. It stands as a silent, concrete testament to the central, unresolved tension at the heart of the American experiment, the conflict between the ideals of an open, democratic republic and the perceived necessities of national security in a dangerous world. Can a government of the people, by the people, sustain a vast, secret apparatus at its core without eventually poisoning the very democracy it purports to protect? The building offers no easy answers. Its walls, which have held the nation's darkest secrets, refuse to speak. It is a mirror, reflecting back the fears and ambitions of the nation that built it. In the 1950s, it reflected a nation confident in its power, certain of its righteousness, and willing to build a fortress to defend its vision of the world. In the 1970s, it reflected a nation racked with guilt and suspicion, discovering a dark side to its own power that it could not reconcile with its self-image. In the 21st century, it reflects a nation fearful, technologically powerful, and willing to trade vast amounts of liberty for a feeling of security. The building is a paradox. It is a symbol of immense power, yet it was born from a place of deep national insecurity. It is a monument to rationality and order, yet it has been the source of some of the most chaotic and irrational interventions in modern history. It is a place of secrets, yet its greatest legacy may be the truths it reveals about the nature of power itself, its tendency to corrupt, to isolate, and to perpetuate itself. What does Langley teach us? Perhaps it teaches us that the tools we create to fight our demons can sometimes become demonic themselves. It teaches us that secrecy is a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundations of trust upon which a democracy depends. And it teaches us that the desire for absolute security is a seductive and dangerous illusion, one that can lead a nation to betray its own highest ideals. The building does not judge. It simply stands, a silent monument to a perpetual struggle. As dusk settles over McLean, the last rays of sunlight catch the upper floors of the two headquarters buildings, the old and the new. For a moment, the thousands of windows gleam like gold, a final, fleeting performance of the openness they were designed to mimic. Then, as the light fades, the buildings transform. They become dark silhouettes against the twilight sky, their inner life revealed only by the scattered, flickering lights that begin to appear in the windows. Behind each point of light is a person, a screen, a piece of the world being scrutinized, analyzed, and filed away. The campus, so serene and academic by day, becomes a silent, humming beehive of nocturnal activity. The work here never stops. The flow of information is relentless. The war of shadows is perpetual. We are back where we began, at the edge of the forest, looking in. But now the silence feels different. It is not the peaceful quiet of the pre-dawn woods. It is the charged, heavy silence of contained energy, the silence of a machine that is always running. The paradox of the place has not been resolved. It has only deepened with time. The beautiful, rational facade hides a reality more complex, more morally ambiguous, and more consequential than its builders could have ever foreseen. This building is a permanent question mark cast in concrete, steel, and glass. Sitting just a few miles from the monuments to liberty and transparency it was built to defend. It is the dark heart of the American empire, a place built on the belief that to protect freedom, some must operate forever in the shadows, beyond accountability, beyond scrutiny, beyond the reach of the very people they are sworn to serve. The trap, built with such confidence and purpose 60 years ago, is now complete. And we are all, in some way, living inside it.